Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of the Jams and Tea podcast, National Retrospective, where we talk about one of indie rock's biggest names. The last time we did an episode on this, we talked about the sort of the culminating moment, I think, of the first sort of era of the National sound. We talked about 2007's Boxer. So go check that out. If you haven't by now, get a little bit more context. But now, of course, we're diving headfirst into the 2010s era of the band with High Violet. And of course, with us today, we have a new face joining us, though not someone who is completely alien to this podcast, considering we have discussed her work on here before. But we have Hannah with us today, one of the biggest national heads we know. So Absolutely. It only figures that we finally got all of our national peeps to join us at one point or another.
Yeah, and just to kind of contextualize a little bit as well, it's quite satisfying how neatly you can cleave the National's discography into two distinct halves, at least at this point. You know, the 2000s run, right, culminating in Boxer, this absolutely triumphant moment. And then the 2010s run, where they kind of settled into this role as kind of like, I guess High Violet was kind of like the coronation of this, and then the subsequent records are kind of like just sort of indie rock elder statesman records to a certain extent. But High Violet, I mean, it's such a momentous album, not only for the narrative of the National as this band kind of sort of slowly building momentum, these sort of initial sort of, you know, Midwestern underdogs, essentially, who really persisted with this kind of quite fundamental, but ultimately very powerful sound, and gradually sort of built up steam. And this kind of represented what was up till that point, and maybe even still is, their most kind of daring and sort of in your face album to a certain extent, because one of the things that defined Boxer, and I mean Alligator, which, you know, we've talked at length about, my favorite National album, definitely an album that has, you know, sort of is a bit ragged around the edges and is a bit more on the sort of like abrasive side of things as well. But even that doesn't, those aspects of that record are kind of like, they're window dressing to a certain extent, whereas like the abrasive, in your face aspects of High Violet are kind of central to its identity and are kind of central to the power of all of its songs as well. It's a record that has a very distinct sound for the National, even up to this point as well, in as much as any of their records can have a distinct sound. It is a self-produced record as well, so the band applied a lot of what they had learned working with Peter Katis on Alligator and Boxer. He helped out here on this record as well as a co-producer, but in large part, the band kind of really sort of took the reins here in that respect as well. And so in a lot of ways, it feels like up to this point, the most extroverted National album, the album, maybe the only real album I think they've made where they almost seem to have this desire to push themselves or to make themselves almost into a stadium band, which is something they've kind of, I feel like they've kind of withdrawn from almost immediately after this. But anyway, it's a fascinating record for me, and I'm sure for others as well. This was my first encounter with the National as well. Like, it was kind of a record that, you know, depending on what age you are as well, depending on, you know, what sort of, you know, era you were at when you kind of first got into the National, like if you're around about the age that we are as well, you know, High Violet, Trouble Will Find Me were kind of the albums that were sort of the most dominant in the discussion of this band. And as opposed to, you know, people who are a little bit more older than us, a little bit more into the millennial generation might have come on board with Alligator or Boxer. But anyway, here we are talking about their 2010 album, High Violet. And I think it's only appropriate, given that she is our guest, that we turn to Hannah at this point. And Hannah, I want to hear from you. I mean, start with, if you want, how you sort of discovered the band, how you discovered this album, and what you think makes it special in the band's discography up to this point.
There's actually like a lot of things in my life kind of led towards me listening to High Violet. One of them was, I think this is like 2010, 2011. And, you know, I'm in like, I think I'm in middle school. Yeah. And I'm like trying to be kind of a conventional, you know, video games, you know, Vlog Brothers, Nerd Fighter kind of nerd. And
oh God, that takes me back. Same.
And yeah. And there's this, so there were a couple of things where one's the summer prior to this, to Portal 2 coming out. And I'll get to that, why that's important in a second. I walked in on a camp counselor playing Blood Buzz Ohio, and just, he's like doing his best Mapperdinger impression. Then with going back to the Nerdfighter thing, playing Portal 2, and I didn't access it in the game. That would be a much more interesting story, but I just heard, oh, that National band did a song for them. Like, and then I hear Exile Vilify, and that's the first song I completely fall in love with. And from there, I just get into, like, in high school, like, I was the only person into the National, because I think, like, everyone else was into, I think like, Odd Future was, like, big at the time, and, like, things like that.
But you were the outsider. You had your finger on the pulse.
The Wallflower.
I can so vividly picture this in my head. I remember being a kid on the bus listening to people talk about Odd Future and sitting there listening to my sad little indie rock shit.
One thing I think that's interesting, just to build off of that, is like this is, I think, the last record where the National were kind of a part of like the current indie rock firmament, I think. Like, because I got into the National around 2012, 2013. So just before Trouble Will Find Me came out, and I was obsessed with this album, that sort of thing. And even at that point, like that was when I was really getting into indie rock and stuff. Like the zeitgeist of indie rock had shifted dramatically from what it was when the National came up with albums like Boxer and High Violet, right? It was much more, for lack of a better word, it was much more of like a realm for people in their 20s, right? It was much more starting to be dominated by music that was, I guess more, okay, so you had the rise of poptimism and all that sort of stuff happening, and sort of the critical narratives and all that sort of stuff. And so the National were kind of starting to be like a little bit more classic rock, right? And so I approached them, and like there was, I guess, getting into them like in an environment where like the current state of indie rock was dominated by your Vampire Weekends and all that sort of stuff, all these really sort of young hip bands. It felt kind of like I was discovering like a classic rock band that were like in their prime right now. And it was like it was a really exciting feeling for me in that sense. In the sense that like I was discovering like what Pink Floyd and the Who had been for like my dad or whatever, and they were happening right now. And it was such a thrilling feeling, but also like the fact that they were capturing that sound, that kind of the feel of that massive anthemic rock and roll, but also they were doing it in a way that was like what the personality of it and what the record sounded like, above and beyond the anthemic aspects and the lyricism and all that sort of stuff, was so much more dour, right? And it was so much more attuned to like a 21st century mindset, and to the mindset of being, like a millennial. And yeah, even though I was still a bit too young to fully appreciate it, like I felt like, when I was listening to the National and at age like, how old would have been? It's like 15. Like I felt like I was accessing like a piece of my adulthood early, and so it felt really, really. I connected to it in a certain sense where it was like I was connecting to this music because like I was wanting to, I was an angsty teenager, right? Like ready to fucking leave all of that shit behind me, and the National were kind of like a, no pun intended, portal towards that. That state of being like an adult, like someone who had like had a sense of who they were, right? I'm not going to get too far into the weeds of the personality dynamics of it, whatever, that's all me stuff, but like that was the appeal of the National, like immediately discovering them and fixating on this album, right? Was that it felt like I'd found a band that were going to represent this like next stage of my life that I was kind of trying to, steamroll my way into, and maybe like jump the queue a little bit. And for that reason, I feel like, my attachment to the National was only grown exponentially, right? Because they were like the first hint for me of something that, I wanted to be, or like a kind of like, I don't know, like a way I wanted to be, or a kind of person that I wanted to be, or a kind of way that I wanted to feel. And like having them in my life since that time has only made that connection stronger. And just to kind of bring it back to High Violet, rather than just sort of getting too sprawling here, I still feel like this is like the though Alligator's probably still my favorite one, just because that has like other personal connections and meanings to me. This is maybe like the quintessential like National record in terms of like what the National were to me when I got into them and what they have kind of stayed as well as I've gotten older as well. What was it like to like discover the National at that time? Like, what was it like to like hear a band like this and to hear an album like this?
I remember bringing out the National with my history teacher, who predictably looked a lot like Matt. And he said like that he kind of enjoyed when he went back to like, you know, Morrissey, because he was in Cantley at the time, or like people like that were like, he called them like, you know, teenage sad. And then the National were like adult sad, of like, these are like real problems. But it also, I mean, it didn't stop me from like, you know, laying on my bed listening to Baby Will Be Fine because somebody wasn't hanging out with me or something. Like
they're kind of a band that sort of teach you how to have those emotions like as you're like growing out of your teenage years, right? They're the kind of band that sort of teach you that it's all right to still be that way. And not only that, because a lot of emo bands do that, but like they're the band that kind of give you the roadmap for how to, you know, transition, no pun intended there, from being an angsty teenager to being an angsty adult. And like High Violet is like right in a song like Sorrow, for instance, or in a song like Terrible Love. It's like these are songs that are so like what these songs are about, and the kind of sadness that's in these songs is so like elementally simple, and like that it feels like it kind of transcends age. And in that sense, like the National like have even more staying power than a lot of my favorite like emo bands or sort of angsty rock bands in a certain sense, because like the sadness that Matt Berninger sings about feels like a universal, it feels like the same sadness I knew when I was a fucking kid and I couldn't, you know, get a bike or whatever. And it's the same sadness that I am, and as an adult having to think about rent prices and shit. Like it's a kind of that they make
the 8-year-old that listens to the Geese of Beverly Road when they don't get the toy at Walmart.
Well, that's what I was thinking earlier when I was talking about how old we were when we got into the National. No, I was thinking like I was like 15 or 16 when I started listening to them, and that's like the 15-year-old listening to mid-career Tom Waits on the bus ride home. Like, what? What are you talking about?
I know some people that did that. Like, one thing I appreciated about it is, and this is why I laughed at the classic rock thing earlier, is that like my dad, they're called dad rock, and my dad hates them. It was like the National was like my weirdly rebellious band, because I think he liked really, my dad really likes like big emotions and really sweeping stuff, and the National were just like literally, I hope my boss gives me a promotion on Alligator, or like nah, like it's raining in New York and I'm sad.
Yeah,
like,
it's not exactly Meatloaf.
Yeah, it's not exactly,
and it's super monotonous in sound. Like even as they go and like flesh out, like to, I mean, I don't want to say like to like a layman's ears, but like for outsiders looking in on this world of indie rock and they listen to the National, this is from an outsider's perspective very much a band that like, you know, dwell in like one of the comparisons I often see from like people who don't really like get in the weeds about this kind of stuff is that they compare the National to Joy Division a whole lot, because they have some post-punk roots of their sound, and because Matt Berninger's very monotonous Ian Curtisy delivery kind of does share a kinship with that. But once you like really start listening to the band, it's, you can't really find something that's like further from something so stark and, you know,
austere.
Not to make a, yeah, exactly, it's like not to make a pun about it, but it's like this is a more colorful version of that kind of sound. And I think it's interesting to sort of contextualize this backwards in the way that I have, because this is the first National album I ever like actually listened to anything from, like not in full, but this was like, anybody who knows the podcast or knows me knows that I didn't start listening to albums or really bands until after I met Morgan. So the way I discovered this is because we made a playlist for each other, and Vanderlyle Crybaby Geeks and Blood Bows Ohio were on that. And I just remember like the most distinct memory ever. I was like showering, and then fucking and then that's when Vanderlyle came on for the first time. I just remember like sitting there and just having this like fucking shower beer ass dad moment where I was just like, oh my god,
that song
and then
is such a fucking standing in the shower fucking song.
Absolutely.
I couldn't make this shit up if I tried, honestly. And that's why, like, I was
You
sort
got to
of
have the one arm on the
that...
wall as well, and you've just got to have the head down, and
Look,
the water is just kind of like going over you.
Yeah.
Listen, I'm not a complete cliche, I promise, but that probably absolutely happened. But
I mean, I've done it.
Regardless, it made me
I
go
contrived
back.
it to happen, unlike
I mean,
you.
like, having Michael as a songwriter is just making things that so that make me
you
want
have to embrace the inner sad bitch sort of self. I feel like when you really get into the National, and that was like the perfect time for me, is because like Hannah, you said something about their sound becoming more universal, and I think that's true, and it's also why I almost feel like I've sold this band short so far, is because the albums that we've talked about so far are like, you know, my ceiling kind of tops out with Alligator, which is an album I love, but like the other records vary from kind of middling to albums that I just sort of respect at a distance. And that's kind of why I was a little bit more muted when we talked about Boxer, is that is an album that feels like it was taking baby steps forward away from where they started, but it didn't really arrive in a new definitive place enough for me. And that's what I kind of view High Violet as. They sort of transition into this more universal sadness that's a bit of a departure from the, like, I won't say that, you know, it doesn't abandon the whole self-effacing kind of suburbanite feel that the National's music has, but it becomes a lot less tongue-in-cheek, and it becomes a lot less like overtly satirical, to the point where this album I feel like is more broadly emotionally relatable. So it feels like a smart move on the National's point to make an album like High Violet as soon as they kind of got the win under their wings. This is the perfect record for a band to make, to capitalize on your popularity, where you don't make any compromises artistically, but you also just sort of play to the strengths that a wide audience would be willing to devour. Because when I listen to songs on here, I'm way more keen to, like, not that I didn't, you know, don't feel things from previous National songs, nothing could be further from the truth, but it feels like an album that you're sort of more easily able to imprint your own experiences on, because those other albums feel very like singularly indebted to Matt Berninger and to where he lives and the kind of environment that he likes singing about, which is not absent here, because I think High Violet, more than any other National album so far, is very indebted to New York. And it's not just because Matt Berninger talks about New York on every single song here and mentions it constantly, but there is sort of a sense of like otherness that he explores here, where he's somebody who both doesn't belong in the world that he's from, but also doesn't belong in the world that he inhabits currently, like on a song like Blood Bows Ohio, for instance. So you kind of have this sort of torn between two worlds kind of thing. And they make that the strength of the album, is sort of exploring the dichotomy of being stuck with this really immediate sound.
It's like an album that's fundamentally and on multiple levels about being in transit, right? It's an album about reassessing what home is, reassessing where you are and whether you're comfortable in that place that you're currently in, whether it kind of lives up to the expectations you maybe placed on it, or the things you needed it to be as you kind of, you know, grew up and moved away from home as well. The relationship between, you know, Ohio and New York, and even Los Angeles, which comes in England towards the end of the record as well. It represents, like, on a meta level as well, it does represent like the fact that the band were originally from Ohio. They then moved to New York, and they were in New York for a while, and then they eventually left New York, I think before this album was recorded. And that's actually, like, it works as an analog on multiple levels as well, because if you think about the early National stuff, talking about what you were saying, Jake, about like how some of the earlier records maybe evoked comparisons to like post-punk bands, for instance. Well, the National were never like a part of this, but they were always in their early era, they were kind of adjacent to the New York post-punk revival, right? And they were kind of following in the footsteps of bands like the Strokes and Interpol, right? Were huge influences on their early sound. You can hear that in records like Alligator, especially, right? Alligator is kind of a post-punk revival record. It kind of is, it kind of isn't. It's got a bit of Baroque in it as well. It does a lot of things. And the National was sort of, that was something, I think their connection to that was a big part of how they sort of started to draw the attention of like the music press and of critics and all that sort of thing, started to become like an interesting band because they were kind of emerging from the ashes of that sound, just as those bands were kind of starting to not implode, but they were making records like First Impressions of Earth and Our Love to Admire, records that I actually quite like, but were, you know, they were on the downturn. And so the National were coming in at this point where it was like they were taking a lot of those aesthetic signifiers and doing new things with them and kind of pushing them towards something new. And then with High Violet, it was kind of like they had been pushing some of those aesthetics sort of more and more and more, and they kind of perfected the post-punk revival sound. That's the most pretentious thing I'm going to say today with Boxer. And then it was like High Violet was like, okay, let's kind of throw out all of that stuff, less brass, less of the kind of monotonous sounds and the sort of the guitar leads and all that sort of thing, more strings, more distortion, and a production style as well. That is one of the most interesting aspects of the record, I think, aesthetically, is that it's a kind of deliberately, messy is not the right word. I like to call it stormy. It's a really kind of cloudy and just sort of like dark album. And again, Hannah, I'm curious for your perspective on this as someone who does mix music professionally for a living. Like, it is a record that's almost kind of like constructed and mixed in a way to almost be deliberately not off or even bad, but just kind of like to really just sort of create this murky sort of sound. And it really comes through on songs like Terrible Love and Lemon World, for instance, particularly strongly. And it's, I think, been a point of contention for some people about this record, especially when you compare it to Boxer, which is such a much more, even though the palette of Boxer is sort of a little bit more simpler, it's a more dynamic album, I think, in terms of how it sounds. It's crisper, it's cleaner, it's just gorgeous. Whereas this is kind of like, it's a bit gnarly, and then it's a bit kind of like ugly in certain ways. And I'm curious about what your thoughts are. I mean, not just you, Hannah, but everyone, what your thoughts are on the sound of this album, especially compared to some of the records we've got so far. Like, how do you feel it complements or, you know, stands in relation to the songs themselves?
Oh, this is gonna be fun because this is for some reason the album that got me into like production and mixing and all of that stuff, which is weird because it's kind of an infamously bad sounding album where, like, I think it's interesting if you listen on like speakers, which I did today, you could like actively hear all the flaws. You could hear like over compression and just like the weird resonances and like Matt's voice and like things like that. And it's like everything's really hard, especially on Terrible Love. There's like a really low resonance on the guitar. It just like
no, I know what you mean.
But on headphones, those are also the qualities that make it such an immersive listen, because you're just kind of being enveloped. If you're just like on an outsider listening on speakers, it's like you don't get the full effect. Like on headphones, if the music is just kind of, you're like swallowed by it, that's how you listen to it. Like,
yeah, it kind of works because like with this theme we've been talking about of like, you know, being at a crossroads or like having to like, you know, being in sort of in a place of sort of psychological turmoil, it kind of works because the album sounds like it's like in a state of psychological turmoil. It sounds like it's clouded, it's messy, it's like confused in a weird way. Like it has this weird, like it's sequenced really, really well, I think, but it also kind of has a strange quality to the sequencing. Like songs like you know, Runaway, for instance, will just kind of come in and just sort of halt the album's momentum completely, and then you go barreling back into Conversation 19 as well.
16.
I think 16. Thank you. My point being, it's a record that sounds kind of just
like its cover.
Yeah, it sounds like it's not doing well mentally.
No, that's what I have always loved about the cover, is how like apparently there are actually words in the cover, but I kind of like it as like just
Oh shit.
scribbles.
You're right. I never noticed this.
I didn't notice this for several
I don't-
years after first
I-
listening to the album.
Yeah, no. I like even looking at it, I don't know what the words are, but that's what, because that was one of the things where it's like loose tar and jagged wool and like all these terms that they were coming up with during the production process for this record. I feel like the National has always been pretty good with like their album covers, like sounding like their albums.
I think to use the album cover as a gateway into the album, it's so funny that we've barely even talked about the songs yet. You're right. I completely agree that their album covers are really great and well designed, and they do kind of give you an insight into how the record's going to sound. I mean, this might be maybe one of their best album covers in terms of serving that purpose. This is a messy album cover. It's got scrawls all over it. And this is kind of the first record where you start to get that more distinctive style of either Aaron or Bryce, I'm not sure which one does it, where it's like a distinctive playing style where it's kind of like just sort of twangy and sort of like sort of like bending the notes essentially, and kind of like almost leaving guitar lines like sort of unfinished or sort of just kind of like reverberating, right? It's something that they've kind of done more and more actually as they've gone on. But
it's like they even do that on guitar now. Like in Renegade, they have like on acoustic guitar, they have like those scribbles too.
Yeah. It's a very distinctive sound, and it's kind of like it's a little detail that sort of serves as a kind of gateway into the whole way that this record sounds. Of course, it's a great cover, not just because of how it represents how the record sounds, but also how it kind of visualizes the sense of kind of like perpetual, anxiety and sort of stasis in like flux that the album represents, right? There's nothing concrete about this. There's nothing conclusive about this. And that reflects the record as well, which is a record about being in a state of flux, block party moment. Anyway, let's get into the songs themselves. I mean, what kind of
there
are songs. We should probably just start by talking about the lead single, I think, because that is the most iconic song on the album. It is the most iconic, some might say the most iconic National song. Blood Buzz Ohio as well. It's the centerpiece of this record. It's very powerfully positioned in that kind of midpoint slot as well. Again, between some of the record's most dour songs, like Afraid of Everyone and Lemon World, are like incredibly just morose pieces of music. And then you have Blood Buzz Ohio in between them. And I mean, everything
which is just a joy.
I mean, comparatively it is. Everything you could point at to say like what makes the National distinct as a musical entity and what makes Matt distinct as a kind of personality is like it's at its peak in this song. I mean, you think about the drum fill, or like the not even fill, but just kind of like the steady pattern that opens this song as well. Like that's one thing I wanted to like. I was really thinking about listening to this morning. Is like, Brian's a great drummer on every National album, and he's always like stands out on every National record. But like this album might be his like finest hour so far. I think there's so much about the drumming and the percussion on this record that is like I just like the hi-hat tips at the start of Sorrow that kind of sound like a ticking clock sped up. Like there's just so many like infectious like bombastic beats in these songs that are kind of like hidden. Like what are some of the songs like that stand out to you guys
as drummer songs?
Yeah, like
I want to like troll and say Terrible Love.
No, Terrible Love's a great example as well. I think Terrible Love is like, when you think about,
it's a great example, but like on record, they like overloaded the console, and I actually prefer it over the alternate version where the drums are cleaner.
See, I've had this weird journey with this, and I'm sure that Morgan and Jake, you might have opinions on this as well. Like for the longest time, I was like, alternate versions way better. What are you fucking talking about? Like it's just crisper, it's cleaner. And like recently, I think just in the last like this year maybe, and certainly today when I was listening to the album proper, I was like, no, I actually I do prefer the original mix. Like it's muddy as hell. It is just completely compressed to shit. There's artifacts in it, like you say, but there's a brutality to it that makes the way the song progresses, and especially the way the song finishes, feel like more impactful, I think, especially like the way that the cloudiness of it contrasts with those like twinkly little piano notes, I think is what they are like throughout the song. Like there's just
That's one of the things I really love is that, like, even though it's basically a demo, but there's also so much going on in it. Like, there are strings, but they're muddled. There's everything.
Multi-tracked backing vocals, and there's so much happening in that song. Like, just the idea of following up a record like Boxer as well. And again, when you think of the definitive aspects of the record, the slickness of that record is such a big part of its identity. When you think about following that up, and the first song you hear is like, it's a fucking nightmare, right? Like, and it's so overwhelming as a listener.
I wish I did more songs like this that just sprawl like that, but not even in the turtleneck rocker way, but in this like way of just like super dense sound collage.
But like, again, and the flip side to that coin as well is that trait is kind of one of the things that makes High Violet so distinct and special as well. And I think maybe one of the reasons why they're resistant to kind of make another song that sounds like that as well. I mean, there's very few that even sound like Terrible Love on this album, but there are songs that do similar sorts of things aesthetically as well, like Little Faith, for instance, which forever has been the most underrated song on this album, maybe one of the most underrated National songs ever. I cannot get over like the fact that like the song is just generally like not very highly regarded by fans. Because that song to me is like, as much as Terrible Love is, as much as Conversation 16 is, like that song is like everything about this album that makes it so cathartic, that makes it so thrilling, that makes it so kind of like, you know, blood pumping. The bass line is absolutely unreal, right?
If I have any issues with like the Nationals, it's like I wish Scott had more to do on literally Scott Devendorf had like anything to do on any album. He actually isn't, I don't think he's like officially credited with writing anything on I'm Easy to Find because Aaron just plays the bass lines.
Yeah, well, and yet he does have a lot of presence here as well, like on songs like Afraid of Everyone as well. I think he has a very distinctive bass part from him. And some of the more sort of sparse moments on this record as well, like it's in the sort of, you know, gentler tones of Runaway as well. And there are moments like where it really feels like this is, you know, the apotheosis of the National as a full band. Like so much of their reputation is tied up in, oh, they're an amazing live band. Like they really just give you this like explosive, cathartic post-rock show when you go and see them, right? And this is maybe the only record that really even remotely tries to translate that. Like it's almost deliberate the way that their album versions of a lot of songs, especially more recent records, will deliberately like omit elements that are included in live versions, or will like strip them down to the point where I think it's one of the beautiful, tasteful joys of a record like I'm Easy to Find. But I have heard a lot of people who say that one of the things they dislike the most about that record is how like radically different the songs sound on it to how they're performed in a live setting.
Absolutely.
I'm going to bring up a very Riley Core reference point here and say that there's definitely a Steely Dan analog going on with the National, in the sense where like their early records, everything up to like, you know, the first three Steely Dan records are like the band albums, and then everything after that is like the, you know, just hired guns, you know, these songs as pared down as much as possible, so there's like very little happening in them except what needs to be there. And then, you know, in a live setting you can explore, like I guess Steely Dan aren't really known for mixing it up in live settings, but like the idea is the album version is this like distinct, you know, entity, or the song that has this particular form that's not intended to represent everything the song is. It's just one iteration of it. Yeah. Anyway, Jake and Morgan, it's been a while since you guys have chimed in, and it's also been a while since we've really talked about the album. I love how unhinged this conversation is. Like, what does this album mean to you? What are some of the standout tracks and that kind of represent a lot of the things that we've been talking about in terms of how this sounds and like how you emotionally connect to it?
The alternate version of Terrible Love feels to me like if you dialed back a bunch of the reverb and other various guitar pedals, dialed back that sound off of like a classic My Bloody Valentine track. It's like, what the fuck are you? That's like the whole point of the song to me, is that it's just a cascade of sounds, and when it's cleaner and crisper on the alternate version, I'm like, well, that just Why isn't it making me deaf? That's the point.
What's ironic about the alternate version of Terrible Love is that like by the end, like it sounds overloaded and overcompressed anyway. So they didn't actually solve the problem with the original version.
They kind of just illustrated how
Yeah.
like it isn't a problem. And it's a great, like, I feel like you could teach a class on mixing using this song as an example of how like what we think of as conventionally good or bad is so dependent on context.
That's why I like it. I went to a Peter Cadis, like a book signing with him for the 33 and a third boxer. And I actually got to tell him like that version of Terrible Love, the one, the like shitty demo on the album, is the song. Like that's definitely a song where I listen and I'm like, you know, how the fuck did they make that sound? Because I'm still not sure. Like that's some of my favorite albums. Like the other album I got into in high school, it's still my all-time favorite, is Pedestrian Verse, the Friend Rabbit album. And that's another record with sounds that I'm like now I know how they got them, but I just don't know how it all like worked together so well.
Like a really distorted guitar bit at the end of Acts of Man, for instance. Like I know exactly what you
I
mean.
love that.
Anyway, just to get us back onto the rail of songs on this album, I want to talk about the first National song I ever heard. What is still, it's hard to make this call, but I think for all the personal connections I have to it, as well as just how elementally perfect I think it is on every level, still my favorite song on this record, very close to being my favorite National song. And that is the song Sorrow, which is the second song on this record, which is a song that is kind of like a song like Blood Buzz Ohio, for instance. It's sort of like a song that distills everything the National are about, like ethos, sound, the idea of the band, into like it's a simplistic form that kind of feels like the most perfect refinement of this idea, essentially. And I mean, that's even on a meta level, because it is a song that is about sorrow, that kind of personalizes that emotional state, and you know, uses typical Berninger-esque abstract poetry to kind of create that, to give it a sort of sense of life, essentially, and an overwhelming control that it wields, and the way that it sort of sustains itself like a tumor across someone's lifespan. And it's a perfect song, I think, because it is so single-mindedly focused on evoking that through every single element of it, from that tense hi-hat pattern that the song opens up with, to that kind of low and sort of just gurgly sort of guitar line that's happening, and then the way that the sort of snare comes in and it sounds really abrasive up against that, like it sounds violent, like it's just smacking the guitar in the face, essentially. And then you have the song just sort of starts to come to life a little bit more with more and more elements as well, little tiny things that are coming in. The backing vocals as well are really colorful on this song too. There's like I don't know who it is, but there's like a female voice that's sort of really buried but kind of comes through in certain parts of the song as well. There's the big backing vocals that come in at the end as well, the wordless ooze.
Oh, the dub band, yeah.
Yeah, everything about this song is like it's like the National are teaching you who they are, and they're almost even teaching you how to listen to their music, right? It's such a perfect song to me, to such an extent that the band took the opportunity to turn it into a performance art piece the same month the album came out, when they played it 100 times in a row for 6 straight hours.
Do you mind if I like be obnoxious and correct you again?
Go for it.
So it actually was the month that Trouble Will Find Me came out. So it was the same month, but 3 years
sorry,
later.
yes, you're right. That's right. May 2013.
I was into the band by then, and like that was funny because like when I played any of the music for my dad, that was how we saw it. It was like, oh yeah, no, it's all there. Like it is just like playing a song called Sorrow 50 times. But I also want to mention that this is kind of, I was thinking about like, it's funny that this is like still an album that I'd call like my favorite, alternating with Sleep Well Beast, because it's also both their most and least gender album, and this song is a great example of that. Where it's like this song feels like the dysphoria song to me, of just how it kind of like impacts every aspect of your life, and how it's like in a lot of, I guess, my writing, even now, is about like whether you want to actually escape that and be better, or whether you don't want to get over it and you just want to live with it. And for the times where I couldn't really do anything about it, just that line, like, I don't want to get over you, was like weirdly comforting, of like, okay, things can't get better right now, and this is how I'm going to deal with it. I don't know. I've always, like, this is nowhere near my favorite National song. Like, I do think it's a little bit too simple, but I also, like, I agree, this is very much the National song. Like, if I'm summing them up in one song, I am playing some of this. If I want to get them into it, I'm probably playing Blood Buzz Ohio, or like, you know, System, one of the more accessible songs. But it's like, play me, you know, the most aggressively sad songs they have, and it's this one.
If I can shout out anything on here that means a particular amount to me, I suppose I want to say I do really like enjoy even the most scant songs on here that feel like they get the least amount of development, just because I feel like they are still fully formed songs, but they do sort of transition the sort of tenets, the sort of big pillars of this record between each other. Like, you have Sorrow, and then I think you have something that's a little like catchier and immediate with like Anyone's Ghost.
Great,
and then you have Little Faith, which is right after that, which I think is a particularly underrated track on here, if I'm being perfectly honest. And then you have another song like Lemon World, which is like maybe my least favorite song on here, but like, rest assured, I love this song. It actually, like, lyrically speaking, and sort of the story it evokes, actually kind of makes me think of The Great Gatsby, of all things. Like, this really upper class world that Matt is sort of talking about, like, becoming entrenched in, but in a way that feels like he's the outsider for the first time, whereas it on previous records it sort of feels like he's a little bit more involved in that sort of, you know, high class old money type of shit. But here he's just like, he's too depressed to even engage with these people. So I really like it lyrically, even if maybe like musically and his sort of like the repetitive do lyrics don't always work for me as well as when he's just like actually being like weirder and vocalizing. But regardless, I still think that like you need a moment like that to go from Blood Buzz Ohio to Runaway, especially when Blood Buzz Ohio is this song that is about like one of the lyrics on this song that gets me the most is the sort of, I've never married, but Ohio doesn't remember me, which I think is a really poignant examination of like wanting to feel attached to where you come from, but subsequently not feeling like you have a distance from it, but you still have such a distance from where you are now that you're, again, that sort of in transit theme of where you don't belong anywhere. And that's what like Blood Buzz Ohio is to me as a song, is that it's sort of like a state of suspended animation that has that like sort of drunken haze where he's like trying to recall his childhood, but like there's nothing about him recalling this reminiscence of being in Ohio that's really all that positive. So it's a really like, despite being a really more upbeat song, it's probably one of the darkest things here for me, is that it's a song that's about not belonging anywhere, and like just the utter resignation with which this is all sort of written with, of just being like, you know, imagine being so sad and displaced that even like a drunken nostalgia isn't enough to get you to appreciate where you came from. And you've got these weird ass lyrics about being carried to Ohio in a swarm of bees, kind of weirdly sort of bringing back the idea of like on Terrible Love, where he's talking about walking in with spiders, how they're quiet company, and like just like insects and these very like, I mean, I feel like this might be a little too like galaxy brain, but like focusing on insects in terms of like, as opposed to like animals, feels like you're trying to examine on like the most pathetic small life forms that you can compare yourself to, so that you sort of emphasize the sort of pathetic nature that sort of bleeds all over this album. So
yeah, Matt has a lot of, like, we've discussed this on previous records, but it kind of gets even truer here as he sort of continues to hone his songwriting style. He has a lot of motifs that will carry across certain songs. And he does a lot more of that thing we talked about with Boxer, where his lyrical style deliberately uses repetition to like simultaneously like evoke a monotony, but also like kind of really reinforce a particular visual or idea. And also just he manages to find a way to make repetition feel really rhythmically satisfying as a singer as well. But just to go back to Lemon World for a second, because that's kind of one of my, like, that's like, I don't know if I want to use the word favorite, but like to me, that's one of the most significant songs on the record for me. And I think what you said about it really kind of hits on a big reason why. And it's to do with like how Matt's evolved as a lyricist and how his focus has shifted as he's gotten older. Like along with that post-punk revival sound that the National were kind of building off of in their early era, like a lot of what the personality and the vibe and the atmosphere and the perspective that dominated those records was kind of that, you know, middle class, almost like yuppie landscape, immersed in the, you know, ennui of the workplace, you know, and this sort of sense of anonymity and all that sort of stuff. And it was very kind of like, it leaned into a lot of cliches, and almost at points it could be sort of embarrassing in terms of like how pathetic and sort of focused around this particular stereotype it could be. I mean, I think of like Theory of the Crows off of the first album, for instance, is kind of like the most a rudimentary example of this, and then it gets refined a little bit on Sad Songs and then Alligator, and Sad Songs and Alligator and Boxer as well. Like all those records are like so dominated by this perspective of the disaffected, you know, drone essentially, who is part of, you know, the many. And you have songs like Baby Will Be Fine, for instance, and Mistaken for Strangers, like, which emphasize that sense of lostness and anonymity in that space. But then as you get into this 2010s era, that particular framework of exploring those feelings and this like stereotypical, you know, ennui-laden office worker, you know, landscape sort of melts away a little bit. And it's about a more sort of generalized feeling of disaffection that I think makes ultimately the National and Matt's writing become more and more relatable as the band go on, as the records go on and on and on, because they get less tied to specific cliches and conventions they're being expressed through, and they get more abstract. And Matt uses more, you know, overtly poetic and less immediately obvious metaphor, essentially, to communicate what he's saying. You know, he uses these references to animals and insects and all these sorts of things, and he uses this slightly more abstract and obscure language that starts to ultimately give his writing more of its own idiosyncrasy and identity as he goes on. And High Violet, I think, is really like the moment where that starts to be like properly masterful and how it's expressed. And like in sort of drifting towards this more sort of like less like this sense of like disaffected ennui or loneliness or emptiness that's less about a particular, you know, being stuck in a particular location and more about being kind of stuck between things, between places, between stages of your life, between jobs, between whatever, between relationships. And you get these sentiments that are so much more sort of naked and unguarded than maybe anything he's ever said before. Lemon World is like has some of my favorite lyrics on the record. Like, it takes me a day to remember a day. It's such a simple, and again, it uses that repetition that I talked about as well, but it's like such a brutal line. And I was a comfortable kid, but I don't think about it much anymore. And then that really kind of just such a gut-wrenching sentiment in a certain extent, to which you kind of like, you know, because it evokes that sense of which, you know, maybe you weren't like fully satisfied as a kid, but you had all you needed essentially, and you don't really value that or reflect on that anymore because you're so consumed now with the inadequacies of your life. And then just kind of contrasting that immediately with the just pure visual absurdism of lay me on the table, put flowers in my mouth. We can say we invented a summer loving torture party, which real National heads will know that one of the working titles for this album
might have been one of the working titles
was Summer Loving Torture Party, which I'm glad they didn't go with. But also, like, again, the older I've gotten, the more I kind of like that.
I feel like that might have been a working title for Mistaken for Strangers too, the movie.
Oh, right, yes.
Very
and that's another bit of ephemera as well that I was going to mention at some point as well, is that movie, which is a fantastic documentary, by the way, and a lot of it is shot around the tour of this album, really kind of gives you an insight into that sense of kind of personality crisis that I think Matt kind of is going through a little bit. That sense of trying to like isolate who he is in relation to the people around him, and that's a really poignant and powerful documentary that we don't really have the time to dig into, but it is worth.
On that topic, I do want to get into Afraid of Everyone, because that is the ultimate, like, you know, trying to keep everything together but also to find who I am song. But it's just like, how can I support my family? And this is something that I think he does really well in Sleep Well Beast too, and that's why I love both of these albums, because all the other stuff is about finding your place. And it's like, okay, I have my place, I have my job, how do I not fuck this up? You know, because it's like, it's not just him going out being drunk. It's like he has a family that he's helping support now. And especially with the other voices following my soul and like things like that, of like, I don't know what to believe. It's like looking for like any sort of truth to latch onto, not even for comfort, but just for understanding the world, which of course has gotten even more complex since the song came out. And it's definitely one of my like overall favorite national songs.
You hit on a really good point, which I think is something that makes the record feel like the most urgent national record up to this point, is that there are stakes, right, in these songs that there haven't really been before. And that is like all the family stuff, that is like having a kid as well, that he directly alludes to on Afraid of Everyone as well. Like that I think is one of the things that makes the record feel a little bit more like it complements the violent and kind of just sort of volatile sound of the album as well, and really emphasizes like how from a moment to moment basis Matt is having to confront and deal with particular anxieties and process everything around him and try his best to like maintain himself. I know that Afraid of Everyone is a song that means a lot to you, Morgan, as well. I'm pretty sure this is one of your favorite national songs. Do you want to talk a little bit about like why you love this song so much?
It's difficult. It's difficult with so many songs on this album because it's become so ephemeral and has meant so many different things to me over the past 6 or 7 years since I started listening to this band. But there have been many different points in my life and different contexts where the outro of the song and the repeated lines of the voice swallowing my soul has bowled me over like a freight train. And I think that's something that really speaks to why we all latched on to this band in our teenage years, is that these songs are all very specific in the way that they're written, but they're also more universal because of that. And they all have moments that anyone can latch onto if they're feeling particularly like garbage.
For me, this is another like how do they do that kind of song for me. I mean, I guess like Blood Buzz Ohio is like the best sounding song on the record, but Afraid of Everyone, the last minute is just like or the last 30 seconds when the vocals drop out. It's one of the kind of most like harrowing and intense things on any national record.
Like Brian's drumming kind of starts to sound like like he's running, like you just evoke the feeling of someone who's just like kind of getting so overwhelmed and just kind of freaking out, and just the way everything comes together like that. I
love the little acoustic. There's like this little acoustic guitar right at the end.
Yeah,
it's so dramatic and so good.
Yeah, it's very kind of like, it's a little corny, but it works for what the song is.
It's awesome. It's like this kind of, I mean, yeah, it's like this kind of like almost like this Western showdown vibe, like right at the end. But you also have like a lot of the like really buzzed out guitars, and that's definitely some of my favorite guitar tones on any national record.
And you got, coming back to the squiggles, you've got that nervy sort of like guitar line that's kind of almost feels like it's intruding on the song as opposed to embellishing it. It's
actually
such
at
a
the
nice
beginning
detail.
when we mentioned that, I even like started singing like the because that's my impression of a Dessner guitar.
It's funny because like I love this song, but like Hey Rosie off of the most recent album is kind of just a rewrite of this song essentially, and just sort of like takes a lot of those musical ideas and kind of just redoes them, especially the wiggly guitar thing. But I love it. I love that they kind of have a formula that this album kind of distills, and it's a well that you can kind of keep coming back to.
I also wish they did more songs like this, because Hey Rosie is just a little bit too mild-mannered. It's like
it sounds great. It's another song that sounds very different live in a positive way, but I do love that song. Yeah, and we're kind of getting into the back half of the record now, which is some songs we haven't talked about as much. So let's start with Runaway, right? The most sparse song on this album, right? By some margin. Like, and it's interesting because it's not only the most sparse song, but it's like the most minimal in terms of like song construction as well. It kind of just is the same song twice. Like it iterates through a certain set of ideas and a structure, and then kind of just does that again. Like, and it doesn't really build much. It creases a little bit with the horn contributions as well, but it's a song that's so still and so naked, and particularly in the really vulnerable way that Matt sings it as well. Like you can almost feel like the words are gonna like get caught in his throat as he's singing them. I love the way he sings, "What makes you think come and join me?" Like he's singing it almost like Jamie Stewart when he sings that. Like it's barely coming out.
It's like, yeah, this is probably, I think it's the weakest song on the record. I mean, it's well placed in the track list, but I just don't connect with it as much. The flood line is like one of the best lines in the whole record.
Yeah.
But it's just like, I'm gonna run away. I won't run because I do. Like very redundant.
Hey, look, I can get it as well. It's a bold decision.
Like Kevin Faced and like the like she's a griever believer Justin Bieber line or whatever. So, whatever it is.
Thank you. I'm never gonna not hear that when I listen to Heaven Face now. She's a Justin Bieber.
Justin Bieber.
Yeah, it is a bold gambit putting a song like this 5.5 minutes right after a song like Lemon World as well, which is already very dour. I'll say my favorite thing about Runaway is that it's kind of like, and it's kind of just an incidental thing, really. It's not a huge, master stroke or whatever. But I like how the fact it's like, it has some of the most like, I don't know, populist lyrics. It's probably a bad word for it, but like has some of the most sort of like, lyrics you'd imagine being assigned to like a stadium pop song, like lose our shirts in the fire tonight. I won't run, all this sort of stuff, like kind of almost cliche. And I like the idea of
throw up your arms in the air tonight. I mean, that's just like an early 2010s pop song lyric.
Shout out Teo Cruz.
It's a cheap thing. it's a cheap.
I also like when Matt does things like that, especially in this era. I think sometimes he just does cliches, and that's super fucking boring to me. But with Runaway, I like when he says like lose your shirt. It's kind of like one of my favorite moments of any song this year, not to derail again, but on the Ethel Cain song Strangers, right in the second chorus, there's like the my memories are shifted to Polaroid evidence, and then there's this little whoa and it just is like right out of like you said, like a Teo Cruz song.
Yeah.
And I actually, that's like the thing that makes me love it, of like, yes, I'm aware I could write these pop songs, and I'm just going to allude to that, but also do something different, because I don't think like many like mainstream pop song would have like enjoying being light of the flood.
The funny thing is, like, you have those lyrics, right, and you have that kind of like, well, I guess maybe less lyrics and more just, I guess, sensibility to the writing, and it's contrasted by this like just such a sparse arrangement. It's such a funny little idea to me to take those lyrics and just kind of put them on a song that is maybe the least commercially friendly song on the record. At least, I guess, maybe if you disregard the really noisy stuff, like it's funny to set lyrics that are that kind of like melodramatically charged to a backdrop that is so ridiculously understated. I enjoy that contrast.
Well, I just wanted to say that it's because this combination that we're talking about is one of the reasons. This is one of my favorite songs on the record, just for the record, because I think the final 4 song long stretch of this album is the best sort of 4-song long stretch that they've made up until this point. This is the best sequence of songs that they've made. And I like Runaway because it has all of this, like that sparse arrangement and those, again, populist lyrics, but it's about something that's fucking heartbreaking. That like moment where, I mean, it's kind of like Morgan said, is it has the one moment that like singularly compels you. And it is that what makes you think I'm enjoying being led to the flood delivery, because the song is about like staying in a doomed relationship. And it's like Matt's parsing through his stubbornness and willingness to persist in like the hopeless desire to make things work. But he's also simultaneously like, my stubbornness doesn't mean that I am enjoying persisting through this misery. Like, it's a really complicated sentiment that's being explored here, but it's also still like, it feels like it's elaborating and almost deconstructing the more sort of satirical side of those previous couple of records. It feels like there's a depth here that lends a sort of newfound humanity that I really get along with in High Violet that isn't quite there in the other albums, and that's just because they're not pursuing those ideas, which is fine. But it's the multi-layered effect here is why I think this is, in my opinion at least, the best National album up until this point here, is that I'm able to sort of densely go through all of these lyrics that sort of play to the band's strengths, but also like you can just listen to this album without knowing that these are all interests of the National as a band and as a concept, because like I kind of feel like you have to know what their shtick is to get everything out of records like Alligator and Boxer. Like you really have to understand what they're writing about and why. Whereas I can recommend this to my friend who occasionally listens to indie rock and needs a sad breakup album to listen to, which I can't really in good conscience do with something like Alligator or Boxer, just because not everybody's gonna relate to being a fucking, you know, suburbanite with kids who gets drunk all of the time. And, you know, like that particular persona feels a bit stripped away here in a way that I appreciate.
And that subject matter thematically leads beautifully into one of the best National songs, Conversation 16. Yes. Like I think, again, like with Sorrow for me, and I suppose Blood Buzz Higher and Terrible Love as well, like this is a moment where it's like, okay, we have a whole set of themes and aesthetic ideas as well that the record is going for, and they're just distilled perfectly into a 4-minute just absolutely immaculate piece of songwriting and music. This song is just, it's gut-wrenching, it's anthemic in its own way too, it's catchy, it has a ridiculously funny music video that I cannot recommend enough, starring John Slattery and Kristen Schaal as respectively a Secret Service agent and the President of the United States. You have to watch...
What?
John Slattery is a Secret Service agent who falls in love with Kristen Schaal, who is the President of the United States.
Oh, Kristen Schaal's the president. Oh, I wouldn't have called that.
No, exactly. And also the National themselves are in the video cameoing as Secret Service members, which is a very funny look. That I've watched their videos. It's funny because it's like an amazing video, and it just doesn't fit the song at all. It just completely at all.
Yeah, it doesn't really. That doesn't sound like it's in keeping with the lyricism.
I just love it because it's fucking John Slattery and Kristen Schaal.
I feel like the National have never been a great music video band,
except for Graceless. I love that video so much, and it's like it's such a distillation of the band's identity and kind of playing with who they are and their perception as well. But I generally agree. I like the Trouble Will Find Me videos a lot.
This and Lemon World are, I think, Matt's best songs as a storyteller. I don't know how influenced by that it is by his wife, Corinne Besser, who started co-writing more with him around Boxer, but I feel like those two songs are like the most complete stories he's told, because a lot of his other lyrics are more abstract.
Worth mentioning that Corinne is credited specifically as a co-writer on Little Faith, Vanderlyle Cry Baby Geeks, and this song.
Damn.
It's funny because like there are so many lines, but it's also like my younger brother likes the song because he thinks that the like I was afraid I'd eat your brains line is funny because everyone thinks it's funny. I love it.
It is funny.
It's like a great and really like silly line in like the best ways. It's like even a little bit campy, which is like a weirdly good look. And I think that's something that Matt would explore more on Elvi.
It kind of works because of how straight-faced he delivers it as well. Like the whole song is so ridiculously dour. Like it's got that Sylvia Plath head in the oven reference. It's just one like completely brutal line after another, and then you get this kind of joke chorus. But it works because it's not treated like a joke, and you can sing along to it and think, "Fuck yes, I am afraid I would eat this person's
now like
brains."
Thousands of people sing along to it every night. And that's really funny to me.
And just making a refrain out of "I'm evil." It's just like it's so just completely like it's the song builds up and up and up, and it's elaborate. And it has these amazing lyrical digressions and lines that have got full of like powerful images and complexity. And then it's like the chorus just kind of rips all of that away, and it's really powerful bit of like bait and switch.
I want to make a zombie movie just so I can include this song in the soundtrack.
So actually, funny thing is that the movie Warm Bodies, which is like teenage, I haven't seen it, but it's like teenage zombie Twilight or something.
Yeah.
But Warm Bodies uses a national song from this record, but it's Runaway.
Missed opportunity. I swear to God.
And they don't use the song that's like, I'm going to eat your brain because I suck.
That was the first lyrical draft.
It was like a Love Memorial, but like with like how the Memorial is like different versions. Because I suck.
I'm a creep.
Fuck you.
But no, there is more seriously, there are some great lines. Like one line I was thinking of was "Fall asleep in your branches," which is just like it's simple imagery. But I also like that Matt has these moments where he's like he decides to be a traditional songwriter and like a traditional poet. Like Green Gloves has the like a drop of ink in a glass of water, and this one has branches. This one has we should swim in a fountain, so we don't disappoint anyone.
All the lyrical motifs that we've kind of talked about, and some we haven't even mentioned yet, that are kind of all over this record, are all in this song as well. You have the repetition that's so characteristic of Matt, like right from the opening line. I think the kids are in trouble. Do not know what all the troubles are for. You have the references to colors that are like all over, like the use of color as a like visual lyrical idea as well. It's all over Afraid of Everyone. It's all over so many songs on this record, and it's all in through here as well, to the point where like I guess it's technically the pre-chorus is the "Leave the Silver Cities, all the silver girls." It's just like it's just like all colors and repetition and nothing else in terms of motifs. And then all of that is just kind of like sandwiched in between these, you know, like deliberately kind of hokey and silly images that are kind of equally tragic and ridiculous, like the swimming in a fountain.
Actually, so the original working title for the song was Romantic Comedy. And then the band was just like, nah, we're trying too hard. And then
that says a lot about the music video as well, because that's the tone of the music video, is that it's the story about, you know, the Secret Service agent and this president, but it's played like a Judd Apatow romantic comedy. It's ridiculous.
This is the kind of song where I can imagine a video just literally interpreting the song of just like, I'm just imagining like it's a celebrity couple and, you know, they're walking through LA and then they're like fighting at home. And, you know, they're fighting over custody of the kids or something. Like there's this, I feel like I would love to see like just a visual rendering of some of this.
It's like
Mike Mills, get on it.
It's like, this is like lyrically, like Matt does this weird thing where it's like, he's kind of, it makes himself like kind of a bit like disturbing, like as a figure as well. Like there's some really sort of like just genuinely like he's speaking on something, maybe it's something he's done, maybe he hasn't, but he's like not afraid to make himself look like really dark, like evil, for lack of a better word, like all these things about like telling his partner miserable things after she's asleep to try and kind of infect her brain.
I love that line.
Yeah, it's so good.
It's because I watched it yesterday, but I listened to that line and I was just like, that makes me think of The Sixth Sense, because at the end, Haley Joel Osment tells Bruce Willis to communicate with his fucking wife through her sleeping. And that always had a kind of weird synergistic combination of just like only being able to honestly communicate when one of you isn't actually present. Like, I don't think that's a direct allusion to that, but I think it communicates the same idea.
And there's the weird like borderline personality disorder lines, like, I'm a confident liar, I have my head in the oven, so you know where I'll be. This just completely sort of, bluntly bald face, just sort of manipulation / just unfurling emotionally. It's such a messy song, and like all the most powerful ways it possibly can be. And it's like one of those perfect examples. Like, I know it's kind of a cliche and you could say this about any song, but like this song could only have been written by this one person, I guess, in collaboration with his partner, obviously, but like it could only be written from that one sort of perspective, or through that one sort of set of lyrical stylings. Like, it just, anyone else trying to write this particular song and communicate these particular ideas would just not be able to, make it work tonally in the way that Matt and Corinne do. It's a masterpiece of a song. It's a masterclass of a song, really. And and to me, like, it's so funny because like you go into England, which is like, along with Runaway and maybe like Blood Buzz Ohio, all that sort of stuff. It's one of the songs that feels like it's most attuned towards, or like aware of certain aesthetic sensibilities where it might have mass appeal. Like, it's a big anthemic, soaring penultimate track. Like, it has all the kind of characteristics.
It's their Fix You. It's like,
it is actually, now that you say that.
Like, this is like the closest they've come to like actually being American Coldplay.
Yeah. No, I get it. Like, even those piano like notes when they come in, it's like, it feels like a film score, right? Like, it feels like massively, and you have the horns that are like, really sort of like, like film score horns do, where they like really kind of nail the emotions, like make sure you're overly aware that this is a big moment sort of thing. It all kind of swells in this way that feels very uncharacteristic of the National, but it also does kind of feel like it brings the album full circle, because you've gone through some weirder moments, some quieter moments, and you're kind of returning to the sense of like hugeness the record started with. And then
I love how the song builds. I think it is their Coldplay song, but it understands like what makes the best Coldplay songs, and their builds really good. And it helps that like Matt Berninger, even at his worst, is a much better lyricist than Chris Martin. Like, there's no like like What Guide You Home thing. I still don't understand what the outro means. Like,
no, I never have had a clue. Like, it's such a
but it's also another Coldplay thing of like the lyrics don't have to make sense, because it's like it's about the emotion more than anything else. And it's also a very good penultimate track. I mean, I've always been a stickler for those.
It's like an artistic convention that's like so embedded now, because like TV shows do it as well, where it's like the penultimate episode of a series is usually the one where shit goes down, and then you have like this moment at the end where the final piece of the puzzle is the reckoning after the storm, sort of picking up the pieces. But like, and I like how much England emphasizes that by like, again, it has that same storming quality as Terrible Love. In fact, there's multiple ways that kind of calls back to that, and specifically evokes that. There's the deliberate references to weather. There's deliberate references to the ocean as well that evokes the refrain in Terrible Love. You have, the whole record's been about displacement as well. And you have like Los Angeles, London, all these different places that are evoked, the sense of placelessness that kind of reaches a pinnacle here of, and you also have, just as an aside, probably the funniest line on this album to me, which is, I don't even think to make corrections. That just really makes me laugh. It's such a stupid line.
Because I love that, because so somebody had the idea that, because the line before it is like, you must be somewhere in London walking Abbey Lane. And
Yeah.
the fact that it should be Abbey Road.
But he's changed it to make the rhyme work, and it's like it's such a little
and then he's like,
moment
I'm not even gonna correct myself. I'm so sad. I don't even care. But just one thing I was gonna say is that like Matt's voice on the outro is it's one of my favorite vocal performances he's done. I also love how his voice like kind of like distorts slightly right at the end, along with like everything else distorting.
Yeah.
And
on the desperate time,
because it's grittier than like a Coldplay or like any other crescendo band would ever go. Like this is not like a Keen song or like a phrase song. No offense to those
God, I mean, you wouldn't with any of those artists have the shit that Brian is doing at that moment as well, where he's like hitting up the cymbal, I think, and then he's kind of doing that kind of rolling drum sound. He's just continuing to keep the energy up, like unnecessarily almost, but you're just so fucking grateful that he's there doing it, because most bands wouldn't. They would just let it ride on the horns and the guitars, but you have that. And what I love about Brian is like he'll do that, insistent, propulsive drumming to really emphasize the song builds, but he always has like patterns, fills, or like a particular thing that he's doing that's not like a stock standard, surging fill sort of thing. He's always making weird, unusual, unconventional decisions with how he approaches rhythm to emphasize the way these songs are building, and it's just so fucking cool. I love that. I love how in your face Brian always is as a drummer. What do you guys think of the way that, so we've had this massive cresting moment, and what do you guys, Jake and Morgan in particular, since I haven't heard from you as much, what do you guys think of the way the record ends with Vanderlei or Crybaby gigs as well? We've got a storied tradition of national closers up to this point, right? And you have, Mr. November is kind of an outlier because it's maybe really the only one where they do the big, massive anthemic, hugest moment thing at the very end. But I mean, Gospel, Lucky You, like generally up to this point, the closures have been kind of like the end credits sort of song where you are just sort of like reflecting and taking a breath. And I feel like this song does that, but it also has this drama to it as well. Like it also has this sense of hugeness as well. It's both the calm after the storm, and it's also like this, dancing in the hurricane at the same time. It's such an amazing way to end the album. What do you guys think?
It's the best national closer, if you ask me.
I think you're probably right. I think so. It's just between this or Mr. November for me, but I think you're probably right.
It's just enough. I can't think of anything that feels more like a closing track to an album. There's a resoluteness to the sound of it, I think, that feels definitive of the album itself. It's almost like a victory lap of the album without actually doing that in a literal way like the Wonder Years do. I don't remember what it was like to have not heard this song. It feels like it's eternal.
And also like the album's kind of bookended by these two refrains that are like two of the best refrains in any songs ever, like Takes an Ocean Not to Break and Terrible Love, and All the Very Best of Us String Ourselves Up for Love. And it's like not only those two great refrains that bookend the album, but there's almost like a sense of resolution to this song as well, right? Like this is maybe the only moment on the entire record where I would say that Matt sounds satisfied. Like it's a song about making peace, right? And it's like, and it feels earned because the record really takes you through the ringer to get to this point. And having it really end on that note of something that feels so like just philosophically beautiful of a sentiment as All the Very Best of Us String Ourselves Up for Love, like this idea that, it's kind of resolving the fatalism of the idea that, we're all, doomed or whatever, and just accepting that and is something that's kind of empowering, right? I don't know, it just makes me insanely emotional. Jake, what do you think?
One word, fellas, and that is strings. My goodness, this
Sorry,
song sounds.
I thought for a second the word was fellas, and I was like,
Guys.
One word.
This is really
Fellas.
one for the lads.
I mean, in a very, if you want to get a little esoteric, I mean, this is definitely this is a sad white boy anthem if there ever was one. Back when I identified as such, it certainly was. This is
Jake's like I no longer identify as white. It's a song that's very much from a white dude's perspective, literally to the point where lyrically it's about a dude talking to his friend named Vanderlyle.
Yeah, I mean, it almost sticks to that whole like national, like, I mean, again, Vanderlyle is like, that's, I mean, like that just evokes, you know, the name Vanderbilt, which is like in America associated with like a rich ass fucking, you know, old money family. And I feel like they're not abandoning that sort of sense of like, you know, even though they're taking this sort of new, more universal lyrical direction, they're still not totally divorcing themselves from their roots by including stuff like that. But I mean, the way a bunch of lyrical themes just sort of come to rest here, you know, the waters are rising, kind of alluding back to the flood that was mentioned previously on the record. And it's sort of, it's resignation, both triumphant and tragic in sort of, you know, this is a song that's about both resignation and acceptance, and how they're both kind of the same thing, in that, you know, at the end of the day, you're still left with what you have. And it's all about, you know, just a level of satisfaction that you either just fundamentally can or cannot achieve. You know, the waters are rising, there's still no surprising you, all been forgiven, swans are a swimming. And I love how it builds. I love the steady drum beat. I love everything. Like, this is one of my most listened to national songs, not just because it was like the first one I had heard, but because, man, it hits me. It is sort of like the quintessential closer. It's not just like the best national closer, in my opinion. It is the ideal album closer, and that it is this steady atmospheric kind of rise and fall, a perfect sort of climax and denouement built into this final track of the record. And it's everything I could possibly ask for. It's my favorite song on this album. I'll never be able to sort of separate my love and connection to it from like my discovery of the world of music that this sort of sprouted from. But I have a real affinity for it separated from the album and just as its own thing, which I think sort of stands testament to its power just as a song. But it is an even better closer than it is like just a song. So
I like that a lot, that idea. I might prefer Sleep Well Beast as a closer, but
that is certainly my second place. I feel you.
Yeah, that rounds out my top three closers, that one.
What's your like number one, or what are your other?
Current number one is probably it's so close between this and Mr. November, but I'll give it to that, then this, then Sleep Well Beast, and then Light Years is very close behind as well.
Oh fuck, I forgot about Light Years. Fuck this band for being so good. God damn it.
No, with Vanderlyle, I see the word strings and Razy I feel like this is the first time we've heard Aaron do the upside down guitar thing where he just goes because he does that on I Need My Girl Live. But I love how that comes in on the last All the Very Best of Us section.
Yeah, it's a subtle detail.
It's not something I even noticed but I listened, but that's the kind of thing that one makes me love this band a lot, is that they'll just have this this thing that's like kind of panned off into the ether, and then it's like, actually this is my favorite song now.
It's also the best indie rock song to ever interpolate the 12 days of Christmas into its lyrics.
What?
With the swans are a swimming line. That's in the 12 days of Christmas, right?
Something swans are swimming. That is correct.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
So there we go. The well of
they need to collab with Sufjan. National Christmas album when?
Oh,
Sufjan's totally due to make another Christmas record, and I think there should be.
It will be 3.5 hours long,
at least.
There can absolutely. I will never listen to a national record because also that's like a Christmas record. Like I think they'd fit a song or two for Bob's Burgers with that, but
yeah, they have Christmas Magic. I think is the song they did about Christmas for Bob's.
And
Burgers.
I would absolutely never listen to. Because also the Destiners are Jewish.
That's a good point. So they could have like
Hanukkah album.
They like Frightened Rabbit have It's Christmas, So We'll Stop. So these guys can have It's Hanukkah, So We'll Stop.
Don't make me think about It's Christmas, So We'll Stop.
A lot of Jewish musicians like wrote like popular Christian songs. Like that's a Jew thing. So
hey, get that bag, honestly.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, let's sum this up now. Should we move into our favorite tracks and ratings for High Violet by The National? Jake, why don't you go first?
By the best estimation I can muster, I will say that my 3 favorite songs on here, I'm going to say Runaway, just so I can give that song the rep that it deserves. Favorite on here is Vanderlyle, Crybaby Geeks, and Conversation 16, Blood Buzz, Ohio. Which one of you is it? Fuck it, both of them. This is our show. We can do what we want. Least favorite song on here is probably Lemon World, even though I love that song. It's just maybe the least instrumentally compelling thing here to me. That said, this album has a very high floor and a very high ceiling, so that really doesn't matter. And I'm giving this album a 9 out of 10. I swear I do actually love this band. I finally get to give them a very high score now.
I mean, you gave Alligator an 8. I would call that very high.
But... I did, but I still feel like people would just be like, "Oh, fucking the Boxer 7."
You didn't give it the number. That's the good number. Morgan, what are the 3 songs at the top of your ranking of the songs on this album?
I'm literally gonna just fucking hit shuffle on the album. Okay, number one, Afraid of Everyone. That worked out nicely.
Hey.
Number 2, Anyone's Ghost. And number 3, Runaway. All right. Yeah, that I couldn't have asked for anything better. No least favorites. Fucking put an 11 on the spreadsheet. I don't care. Fuck them.
My 3 favorite tracks on High Violet are Terrible Love, Sorrow, and Conversation 16. My least favorite is Fuck You.
That's my name.
And I'm giving this a 10, the 10 it deserves, my second 10 for a national album.
Right. So I guess it's me then.
Yes, it is you, Hannah.
I'm just going to pick the 3 songs in the middle of the record. It's Afraid of Everyone, Blood Buzz, Ohio, and Lemon World. I'd say Runaway is probably my least. Yeah, it's still my least favorite. Let's rank give it like a, sure, 9.5 or whatever.
So that gives us overall an average rating of 9.6 for the Nationals' High Violet. Please let us know at home what you think of this album, where it would rank for you in your ranking of the Nationals records. At what point in your journey with this band did you come into contact with this album? What does it mean to you as a result of that? What do you think about the overall concepts and thematic ideas and the sounds, all the sorts of things we've talked about? Please let us know your thoughts in the comments below as well. If you enjoyed this conversation, please consider giving the video a like and of course subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. Both those things help us a lot. Hannah, thank you for joining us. Really, really appreciate having your input and your national expertise on this record. Is there anything you would like to say or plug to the listeners at home before we wrap it up?
I mean, I'm always doing something. You can follow me on Twitter or Instagram as Hannah Jocelyn C. I'm always working on something for Pitchfork or for my own stuff. I have some of my own music in the works. I put out an EP in April called Self-Talk as my new project, The Answers in Between. And I'm really proud of that. I think if you like High Violet, you're probably going to at least appreciate somebody without that kind of money going for that sound.
I completely co-sign as well. I think, as I've said in the past, when we initially shouted it out, I don't know if I actually said this, but I do think that your new EP is the best thing you've made so far. And so everyone else who is out there and interested in indie rock and just pop music in general and in the sort of music that we talk about should go and check that out. Link will be in the description as well. As always though, folks, rock over London, rock on Chicago, Miller High Life, the champagne of beers.